sort of subtitled this Valuing Risk Effectively because I think that's probably the best takeaway from this. I know a few of you got bored by me last year, so I'll ask you challenging questions towards the end to make sure you were paying attention, and also maybe ask you what you did differently as a result of last year. This is not the same presentation, you'll be glad to hear, not least because the world has moved on, but also because I think I've learned a bit more about procurement in the last couple of years and working with Tanya and the team, and kind of got more of a feel for what you might all care about. Normally, I tend to work with chief security officers, and funnily enough, they do tend to care about many of the same things in their organizations. Just out of interest, how many of you work sort of routinely with the security or a similar function in the business? Yeah, it's a little bit less than half, which saddens me, obviously. So I guess if I offer you one thing, it would be that they usually have some things that can be greatly helpful to you. And if they don't, you should badger them to get them. And then when they make procurement requests, especially to small British vendors, you should support them. But actually, joking aside, a lot of what I'll talk about here is going on in your organizations. And what I've tended to find is that it's not being carried across the organization as well as it could be. I think that's one of the big failings we have, is that quite often we see things, and this will hurt you as procurement people, but I quite often see that enterprise subscriptions for things are being bought several times in the same enterprise. Does that sound familiar? And obviously a lot of vendors are very happy with that situation. It's not, and bizarrely we're not, because we would rather, certainly in what we do, that actually information knowledge is shared, because that's what makes you safe, and otherwise the thing's a waste of time. So I want to go through a few things. And first of all, background to the world at the moment. It's a wonderfully depressing way to start the morning. I'm sorry there aren't drinks immediately after this, but you can save those up until about 5:30 when you'll be ready for a strong one. It's easy to be paranoid, but I mean, I do regard it as a world of opportunity as well as crisis. But we certainly live in quite interesting times. And I think the key thing I would say is that the range and tempo of threats is multiplying. I think there are less sort of massive threats than maybe the world has seen in the past, but we're back to a world where there are lots of small things going on, geopolitically and otherwise, in terms of developments, and together those are creating very interesting environments. So that is it's just something we have to live with. And technology that we've already touched on in a number of areas is accelerating the trend. From things as simple as terrorist groups obviously being able to exploit secure communications in a way they've never had before, and the challenges that's causing, for example, social media companies, just through to the disruptive effects of things that we're currently seeing. Of course, as we're finding any good idea technologically, people always manage to turn it to something horrible pretty quickly. So it's always a challenge, and that always has the ability to disrupt us, certainly from a security and risk point of view. And also, I think events as a result are highly interconnected. They always have been, but it sometimes took longer for things to emerge. And what we find now is that things happen very quickly because of those connections. And it's very rare, the thing that's in the headlines today that comes and gets you, because you know about that. So I could talk to you at length about things like the South China Sea, about things like Iran's role in the world, North Korea. You see those things. It's the consequences of maybe something that's affecting North Korea that leads to a change in US relations with China that affects your supply chain in the central US. And obviously the Midwest right now is suffering quite heavily from geopolitics. It's those sorts of things. It's those second-order system of systems effects that I think tend to catch people, because we're looking at the obvious. And I think if I asked many of you to think about your risks, you would write down, and I'm sure that most risk processes are like this, you write down all the ones you can think of, right? But you never challenge yourself for the ones you can't think of. You never challenge yourself sort of the other way around, because no one gives you a framework to test off. So I'll come back onto that. But I think spotting those system of systems effects is a really important thing, because they are the things that will hurt your supply chain. Some of them you can do something about, some of them you have to plan for. But against this, we're in a very global and competitive marketplace. And as you all know, there's this drive towards lean organizations, just in time. You get to the point that for a car manufacturer, over half the people working at the factories are actually people from delivery companies, and they have to have a piece of the production line no earlier than 3 hours before it's needed, and no later than about 30 seconds before it's needed, to go on the vehicle. They didn't want stuff sitting at the factory. I mean, the sensitivity of that is extraordinary to disruption. Now, once upon a time, we didn't have the technology to do that, so we had to have resilience. I think we're on the verge of losing that. So that's my underlying theme. But just illustrating that kind of system of systems, this is the overlay of how we see events in the world. Any questions? I mean, if you can understand this, you understand everything, so it's fine. I'll just move straight on. No, but it's That's our sort of mental thought process. So I want you to take that away when I talk to you about how my company sees the world, how we look at it, how my analysts view things. That's the kind of mindset I want you to have through this. There are 10 key themes we're looking at over the next year. These evolve slowly, so those of you who did see this last year, they're mostly the same. Unsurprisingly, because strategic themes shouldn't be changing every 6 weeks. Anyone read the outputs from Davos, the annual meeting at Davos? Okay, you're saving yourself some stuff there. But it's an interesting, it's only 450,000 a year to be a member, so I think Procurious is looking like excellent value at that point, isn't it? There's some great stuff in there, but it's based on perception of risk. So their report every year basically says, this is what chief executives and boards perceive to be risk. And of course, it's always based on whatever's in the headlines at the moment. So it's interesting. It's always playing catch up. And so I think things like that can be worrying. Now, you all know that's what the board will focus on, right? Suddenly it's cyber. 3 years ago, if I said I worked in security, everyone thought guards, gates, guns. Now it's cyber. I get asked every time, oh, so you're in cyber. And I'll come back on again to my view on cyber because it is important. But you know what's going to be on people's radar because it's whatever they read recently and they're going to be obsessed with that for about 6 months and move on. Again, my contention is strategic threats are pulsing away, and actually, if you chase what's in the headlines, you'll lose sight of the things underneath that will then come and get you, certainly in this context. So I won't go through all these in detail. Obviously, economic volatility is something we're increasingly worried about. I've called it oil resources and currencies because that is where the effect is. A lot of countries are very worried about the strength of the US dollar. This is one of them, or at least half of this country is worried about it, the other half isn't. And there's a lot of stuff going on in the currency space that's making things very uncertain. Now, that's a financial issue for many companies, and you can kind of deal with that and hedge it. However, countries cannot. If you look at Argentina, for example, struggling a lot at the moment with the effects of loans in US dollars, a strengthening dollar. It means emerging market currencies are struggling further. And then, of course, that means that more people go back to the dollar strengthens further. The president gets quite upset at that point because he's keen to have a weak dollar. There's a lot of uncertainty in that area. And that causes huge actual impacts on the ground around the world. And you see it. It does mean you can have cheap conferences in places like Argentina and South Africa at the moment. So there's always a silver lining. But it's a pretty awkward moment for a number of places. And it's really stalled the sort of BRICS mint development of emerging markets that you may have come across. The Sunni Shia divide I keep putting on here, and I did obviously have to produce this presentation in good time because Holly made me do that. I normally like to do it sort of the night before, partly because this stuff changes and can be more relevant. So I think I got this to Holly sort of late last week, and on Monday, I think we had the attack in Iran by Sunni militants attempting to stir up the Sunni Shia divide, which is a very big problem in the Middle East and obviously affects a lot of relationships there. You have two blocks effectively emerging around that, and the jihadists in the center of it, so my third theme, working away at that. And that's something we're pretty concerned about because of the effects it has. Now, the UK, the US, and Europe are wading into that debate via Iran. And of course, it expands into Syria and across much of the Middle East. It's a fundamental theme that's not going away. And again, it has such large consequences. That's why it's one of our big themes. Sustained migration, you've heard less about, but that drives the next theme, which is the rejection of globalization. And we've seen that here. We've seen it in the UK. We've seen it in Europe. And it's an ongoing push. And it's a very fine balance at the moment between views on globalization and the effect that's having on the growth of right-wing. Right-wing terrorism, both here and in Europe, is probably 2 to 3 times as large in terms of number of incidents and things going on as jihadism. We're focused on jihadism, but actually the right-wing is really actually much more dangerous and developing. And in fact, most chemical-related plots, or CBRN plots, have come from right-wing groups. Rather than jihadists. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, partly because it's more disorganized in the right wing, so it's harder to track down, partly because it's seen as being more pro the nation, it's kind of defensive, so I think it's easier to overlook. But it is being overlooked to an extent, certainly in the media and certainly in awareness of what's actually going on. So that's quite a strong thing, and of course it has less security orientated but more disruptive consequences in politics. The US environment, we strive to be unbiased, absolutely, but you can't get away from the fact that US policy at the moment is having consequences worldwide and disruptive consequences, partly because that's the ambition of the people who are setting that policy. They want to disrupt things, and I think we've seen that in the UN in the last week. So love it or hate it, it is something that's happening, and that is definitely affecting the rest of the world. There's no getting away from it. And the world's most powerful economic and military nation is changing its course of events on things and also arguing it's not being treated with enough respect on the world stage. That has consequences for other big nations, which takes us through Russia and China. Russia we focus the most on in headlines. I live in Salisbury. I was in Salisbury the afternoon that a GRU colonel and a GRU captain decided to come and try and poison someone, and then left the device they actually had in a charity shop bin where someone would find it. And someone then did find it, and someone died, who had nothing to do with the reason they were there. This is bad behavior on the world stage, as is then trying to lie about it. We get this. There are reasons Russia does that. There are geopolitical reasons this is going on. Real things, we focus on that. China actually much more interesting, much more powerful, and anything that you hear about Russia is going on probably times 10 with China, albeit without the ridiculous hit squad attempts. But that is happening all the time. So these are things ticking away, and again, Russia's dominating the headlines, China's more interesting in the long term. But I've been saying that for 15 years. But it is. I mean, I definitely keep an eye on China. We see it as the opportunity. You may have seen the fuss about Google in the last week or so and Dragonfly, and the backlash they're getting about having to work with the Chinese government to do what they want to do. But I don't know one company that's not trying to be in China. Any of your companies deliberately not trying to ever get into China, not interested in the Chinese market? It's pretty rare. I think unless you're banned by the US government from selling technology, it is it's something we all want to be in. It's going to be huge. So you have to learn to live with that, navigate it, and work with it. Technology and cyber, I think we're all living through that one. I don't need to elaborate. And again, I'll come on to my view of cyber. And then environmental issues. It's an important theme because it's so disruptive. We can't do much to predict it, but we all tend to know where it's going to happen. Is anyone quietly waiting for sort of some of California to disappear into the sea? Like, we all know it could happen. Istanbul is probably 20 years overdue a catastrophic quake. These things are out there, but we live with it. But I would put it to you, they become more impactful because of where we live in the planet. And again, the effect these things have on us now is so much more magnified than the damage they would have done when no one was affected as much. So I think that's why it's so important to us. And of course, things are changing, and there's a lot of consequences around the slow but notable effects of environmental change, and even just the reaction to that and the perception of it. So I won't go through these in detail. What I can do, if people are interested, we can send out the full report. We did a mid-year report about 3 months ago, and we've got the annual coming out in about 3 months. So it's sort of the worst time to talk about this in a way. But just an example of the sort of things that we're tracking amongst our sort of top-level global risks. We've got about 160 of these sorts of things that we go through. But again, I try and highlight this because these are scenarios that are likely to affect your business in some way. So even if it's not you directly, you are the guardians of your supply chain, of course, and do you fully understand where your supply chain runs and what they're dependent on? And so again, I put it to you as you think about risk. It's quite good to test against these known scenarios. Again, I'm happy to send, I think the slides are going to go out anyway, but I'm happy to send out the deeper background to this, which is more useful than me running through it. Certainly in 20 minutes. The red places are places I wouldn't recommend going to on holiday in general. And the flashpoints are the things that we're kind of tracking. So you can see there's a lot of stuff going on. And I don't think the locations would surprise many of you, the areas we're most looking at. The shading is a range of risks, and that's not just security, but it's stability, policy, criminal risk, governance risks, child labour, and a kind of combination of all those things. But none of that should be particularly surprising to you. But then how much of our supply chain is coming through these parts of the world? I'm probably missing a star in Nicaragua, actually. But, I think we can't get away from the fact that really this equatorial belt is where a lot of things are going on. Okay. So what's our approach? Wonderfully pessimistic, right? How to deal with all this? This is my contention. I think if you do adopt an intelligence-led approach to this stuff, you can get ahead of it. I think you don't have to be a victim of the red spots on the map and the stars and the headlines. So I'm going to give you a few things, really, about how an intelligence-led approach can be derived. And I think that helps you really understand your risks. And this is what, ultimately, this is about building sustainability. And I think security is resilience, is sustainability. And that's what we're all here to do. You're here to make sure the organization is getting a good deal and is resilient and doesn't suddenly run out of the stuff it needs, right? This is really the way to underpin that. So we talk about intelligence, and unfortunately it's not all fast cars and guns. Well, in fact, it's never fast cars and guns, sadly. You might work with people that make fast cars and guns, but that's about as close as you get. We're really interested in the top of this. And the problem we have in the world nowadays is there's so much of this. So 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you had to fight for information. You had to work really hard to kind of get anything. And probably about 15 years ago, that flipped, and now everyone's an expert. That is just such a change. So refining that down to wisdom takes a lot of effort, and we focus on people, process, and technology to do that, as anyone would. There's no one size fits all. Technology is not going to solve an intelligence problem, but it probably helps you solve it. Effective processes mean actually you can do the most, and I would argue that's the one thing you can do for free with just a bit of brain power, and you need effective people. So again, my hope after this is that you're slightly more informed on process and a bit more effective as people. I can't help you with the technology bit, but I'd actually argue that's probably the least important. And that's how we actually derive intelligence. We call this the intelligence cycle. If you imagine a big spy agency, it probably only does even one piece of this. But the great thing you get to do in business is you get to do all of it. So no one's job at the CIA is all of this. It just isn't. But the organization probably does most of it. Fundamentally, it's interested in that, which is getting information about what's happening and refining it back to people. It's pretty straightforward, really. I mean, you have to manage your process, which you can do yourselves. Direction, so what are you trying to do? What do you want to know about? Well, you know about your supply chain, so you want to know about things that affect your supply chain. What's going to break it? So you work out where to get information from. You save that information somewhere in a way you can find it again. And that can be as simple as getting a daily email from the papers, storing it in one folder so you can read it and search it. You then do something with it. And then you get that back to people that need to know about it, and they can take action. This is all there to support making decisions. That's how it works. And that constantly then goes on, because once you feed that back, your requirements maybe change. And of course, the business changes. It might be in new markets. It's going to change all the time, especially in your world. The advantage you have is that, again, you know your supply chain. So you kind of know what you care about already. And the hope, actually, for most of your companies, this should be going on somewhere already. You might have to catalyze that, but there are resources. Most of your companies will have subscriptions to intelligence providers or information providers and partners who are doing some of this for you. And then you can refine what they're sending you. But in terms of incidents that might affect you, or in terms of exposure, that will be going on. It's more complicated once you start putting a lot of things around it. If you want to get very technical, these are all the things that we kind of do to understand the world and kind of do something with it. So again, where are you getting stuff from? Actually, do you have a plan of how you're getting that material? Do you think about what sources you could be using? And actually, a meeting like this is part of your collection process. I would put it to you. Collation, again, where are you storing this stuff? Otherwise, nothing happened. But I'm sure many of you read the news. And again, I put it to you, if you read the news, at the moment, you're probably reading it, taking some things away. Maybe you send an email to someone with an interesting article. You could probably read the news with a bit more structure, or have a process for scouring through news, delivering a summary of the most important points and what they mean. And I think that's the key part is, the so what. When you do analysis of any of this, what is the so what for me? If you can extract a so what, then great. If you can't extract a so what, you're sending around data. It's not intelligence. Again, intelligence is something that supports a decision maker. And what we're most interested really is the high impact, low probability events, frankly, isn't it? If something is high impact and probability, you're already thinking about it. This is your classic top 10 risks that you could probably all write down off the top of your head. Massive cyber breach, failure of a particular supplier, whatever it is. Low impact, high probability, you're dealing with that every day. It's theft from your supply chain, whatever. Low impact and probability, why are you caring? Honestly, a waste of resources. So again, it's this, the nasty surprise, the high impact, low probability event. That's what you want to spot. I put it to you. If you're not seeing some of those others, actually, then you might want to care more. But that's the thing I want you to pick up on. So how do you do this? Again, I contend you have a fantastic view of the business. I think you're parallel with the security teams in that. Probably better than anyone, actually. So you are ideally placed to see what matters. And you are fundamentally involved in sustainability and resilience. And the reason I said before, the just-in-time stuff is impacting you more than anyone. Again, it's the emerging threats. It's those high-impact scenarios you didn't spot that become a crisis. Anyone here enjoy a crisis? Okay, is it good for your career?
Just want to throw
Yeah.
to us. I didn't know when to ask this, but yesterday we had Elizabeth Linder, former Facebook executive,
Yeah.
speaking with our consulting leaders, and she talked about these anecdotal things that you see on social media, and the importance, even though they're not data-driven yet, but they are very indicative, is her view, and we can ask her more today. What's your view on that? How seriously should CPOs be monitoring the chatter online and filtering insights from that?
It's a very good point. Because one of the other things you have, and this is the classic debate we have about misinformation, disinformation, and there's both going on social media. And some of it's just good-natured misunderstanding of things, reporting false stories. Snopes is your friend for that one. Is this stuff true? Some of it's deliberately seeded out there. These two gentlemen were just visiting Salisbury for these couple of days in London because they're two, middle-aged Russian gentlemen who really like cathedrals, and they like them so much that they go there every day. And I can tell you, no one takes the train from London to Salisbury at the weekend twice unless you have to. So that was the big giveaway on their side. But, that was, they're deliberately pushing around disinformation about, activities and things. So you've got to be able to spot that. The risk is that your employees will understand it. So sometimes, even though something's not true, it's having an impact on you. And then you have to counter that. Now, the worst thing is when that's affecting your organization. And this is, a very big PR question. But you can't ignore it because it's not true. You've got to get into that space and dominate it and try and get your own message out in a way that people hear. Because what's the common thread of most misinformation, disinformation is it's amusing, it catches people's attention and it spreads. Or it reinforces the bias that exists. So you've got to counter that. So I think regardless of whether it's true or not, you've got to pay attention to it to understand it, contextualize it, and react to it. And again, I think a sound intelligence process helps you do that because you're checking things in the round. You don't just accept a piece of information as a given. You put it in context with what else you're seeing, and you come to a judgment about it. But again, you can't ignore the impact it's having on you. And sometimes people get obsessed with things that don't matter. To an extent, does it matter? I mean, it's a tragedy, of course, and it matters to the families and everyone else, but does it entirely matter who shot down an airliner over eastern Ukraine? If the reality was it was shot down because it's a dangerous area and people are firing surface-to-air missiles. You could obsess absolutely about who did it, but actually for your organizations, the bigger thing should be we shouldn't be working with airlines that are flying, whose policy remains to fly over dangerous areas like Syria and eastern Ukraine when other airlines do. I mean, that's really that's the actual so what, rather than getting bogged down in the detail or the conspiracy theories and things that people sometimes get sucked into in this world. Does that answer your question, Tanya?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the question is then, so you have a supplier in Myanmar or something, and you're reading, is the question then, well, we shouldn't be in Myanmar, or is it that we need to, it's quite a dramatic decision, obviously, to move out of some.
Oh, a great market. And Iran is the classic one with this one. Now, you could read the writing on the wall about Iran. We helped a number of companies that wanted to go in, partly because the European Union pushed them in after the deal. But we had to say at the time, we think, I wouldn't do anything you can't just pack up and walk away from. But you couldn't ignore the market. People said, it's 80 million people, relatively good middle class, oil money. We need to be in there. We can't wait. But then you had to be prepared to walk out. Big decision. That was a clear one because you wouldn't be allowed to do business in the US ever. And any other US company is not allowed to do business with you if you're operating in Iran. I mean, that's a showstopper. It's more subtle when it's, do we understand whether or not there's child labour in our factories? Our second order suppliers. And actually, I come on to that second order thing because it kind of goes with having a risk model. So one of the things here is that if you're testing yourself against a model of the world, any sort of structured model, and this is what we do with the military as well to come up with a plan, there's a list of things you deal with yourself. You have to ask yourself a whole bunch of really irritating questions. And the result of that is quite often that you learn something that you didn't know because you ask yourself a question you would never have done if you just kind of started from the top, written down everything you'd thought about, and then moved on. So having a sort of structured thing that makes you work through any sort of process and come out with an output helps you answer those questions. And I was joking with some people a couple of years ago who I said, well, you probably don't care about child labour in Cambodia, but have you ever looked? And then they did go and have a look, and the company that made their corporate clothing was in Cambodia, and they hadn't checked out whether or not it was on a blacklist or anything else like that, because just hadn't thought of it. And it made them think of it. Now, I think their supplier was okay, but they're now aware and they've got that on their radar. So when there might be protests around these issues or anything else, they don't get targeted as a client of someone who's up to no good. Another example is unpaid internships, minimum wage issues and things like that. You have suppliers that don't follow some of those things, and those are issues in parts of the world. And again, you get targeted because your suppliers are effectively using slave labor in a Western context. So I think, again, testing yourself against the structure model helps with that sort of thing. So I encourage you to do that where you can. Come up with any structure you want. There's some you can use off the shelf, but I think doing it this way, kind of looking at certain things and saying, okay, water security in South Africa, will that affect us? Is that a problem in South Africa? Is it a problem in Ethiopia? Is it, will it affect us? I think understanding your supply chain and mapping that to an existing model, you'll kind of see those things that intersect. I think without that, how are you testing all of those elements? You're probably testing it against things you think of, and that's a lot of work for your team, actually, and for you mentally, right? So I think that's one of the areas that a process can help you. The other thing I want to highlight to you is something you should be thinking about is scenario analysis. And again, the advantage you have, I would put it to you, is you don't have to care about where certain world events are going. You don't have, I have to. I have to sort of say, what does this thing, what does this UN meeting mean now? What do the president's statements mean? You can go from, I would suggest, from what breaks the organization? What are the things actually that break my supply chain? Because you understand that anyway. So let's say, actually, if shipping couldn't get through the Straits of Hormuz, it would kill the company or have a really big impact. Okay, so what would lead to that? You can kind of work back from a defined outcome because that's what you care about. And frankly, anything short of that isn't going to break the company, so you don't have to care. But you want to kind of see if we're going towards a situation where Hormuz is shut or, and suddenly shipping can't get through the Red Sea and actually suddenly your ships from somewhere are going, it's going to take 3 weeks extra to get everyone's Christmas presents to the US. That's going to be a problem. So I think you have the advantage of picking the scenarios that could affect you and then working back and saying, what are the warning signs that we need to start stockpiling? Or we need to start allowing more time, or we need to find new suppliers. And I think that's a really helpful thing that you guys can do, and certainly lead on. And again, it could well be, and I hope that most of your organizations have an analytical team somewhere in the security function, or the risk function, that can actually look at the problems you give them. If you don't have that, you're going to have to find people to do it. But I would encourage your organizations to be thinking this way. And again, I can't do that for all of you just from here. I have to work out what the world looks like, and then you can map onto that. But you have the huge advantage of doing it internally and saying, right, these are the 18 things that could hurt us. How do we get, what's going to lead us to that point? So in other words, do I need to care? Is my world changing or not? Or the world might be changing. Is it affecting me? So again, scenario analysis, really big. Geospatial, I won't overlabor. It's pretty simple, but it is quite useful to be able to see things that are affecting you on a map. That's really the key point of this. More for some businesses than others, but it's super simple to do for free. Really, really simple. You just need to have a somewhat structured database of incidents and things affecting you, and then you can map it really, really easily. You need Excel and a free program called QGIS, and you can do the whole thing for free, which is great. So again, you get someone reasonably bright on your team that wants to play around with these things, and people love coloring in. I absolutely recommend this to geography majors. It's a brilliant thing for them, and all my team that do it are geography majors. But it's great because you can see. So that's a few years old now, but that was like pipe areas of notable FARC activity. Actually seeing a reasonable number of incidents, and then overlay of pipelines, and it was kind of able to prove that actually the pipelines are most likely to be interdicted and why, and actually supported the routes that they were trying to build. The Chinese are building pipelines out this way to get rid of this problem and this problem. And then that was actually for charities operating in DRC, village locations, project sites, and where proposed travel was. Again, it can just kind of support stuff that you're doing. And especially, as you say, in some of those more intricate areas where people go, oh my God, Turkey's bad. Everything in Turkey is bad. And you can say, well, actually, where we are is not bad. So we don't need to pull out. You can understand your risk and your mitigation. Anyone doing business with these fine fellows? Okay. Integrity due diligence. I'm sure you are doing this. I'm sure you are screening your suppliers and everything else. I just would encourage you to do ongoing monitoring and screening where you actually kind of keep an eye on things dynamically, because I'm aware, for example, of a company in the UK that supplies the government that fell on financial hard times, and the investors are a front company for the Iranian government. They're still a government supplier to the UK because they were screened a few years ago and they're not due a rescreen yet. But in the intermediate time, the situation has changed. The company has changed ownership, and that's now where they are. I'm not even sure the company knows that that's what's happened to them. But again, it's not really been picked up. We came across it in the course of research, but it was, it's not been picked up because they haven't been rescreened. So the more you can do to be dynamic about screening about these things, then great. And you've all seen as well in the current slightly pro-sanction environment that we're getting, this can change very fast. So if you don't have knowledge of where your exposure already is, and the kind of areas that could start to become red flags, and then suddenly you're into this big exercise saying, God, where are we exposed to Iran? Not only us, but where are our suppliers exposed to Iran? Because we're not allowed to do business with those suppliers anymore. And that's the sort of thing I think that can probably cause headaches. Anyone having that sort of headache at the moment? You might. It might be coming. So, understanding who's, the clients of your clients, effectively, or the clients of your suppliers becomes quite important. Again, if I'm doing business with Iran and I'm doing business with you, the US government will come after you to get rid of me. So you get a knock on the door. Not me. They're all going to pressure you to get rid of me. And that's been the big change now. And again, the government can track it back because they know who they're interested in. They'll look at everyone that touches that person and then everyone that touches those people. You need to be able to do the same in reverse, and that's a much harder question to do. So I would say anything you can do to get on top of this sort of stuff, great. Now, a lot of people in various parts of the world have been quite surprised being suddenly sent vendor paperwork when they've supplied a company for 10 years. That's why it's happening. I encourage you to get ahead of it. Okay, and the key part of implementation really, for whatever you do with what I've told you here, again, kind of assess what works for you. We use, I talked about some of the military approaches, but having a kind of factor deduction, so what am I going to do about it? 3-column model is very useful. Decide what you can actually do, implement something, and then keep pushing it forward. Pretty simple. Like any other project, really. But there's just a few points on that. And again, we'll share the slides so you don't have to sort of desperately write everything down. But just a few steps there where I think you can kind of implement something for free, which we all like, and just a bit of sort of elbow grease and thought towards it. And then finally, so I'll really leave you with these top 10 tips. And I think the key one for me is the first one, which is just do something on the back of this. I said you can do something as simple as the papers that you're already reading, just do something with it. Have a process for like information that you're already assimilating, sending it out in a structured fashion to people that can do something with it, and having a follow-up around it. Again, work from outputs. Don't try and understand everything. I think if you can start understanding what matters the most, you can build something out of it. Your customers, of course. And I think the main one, actually, in a way, is speak truth unto power. If you spot something that you think is going to cause problems, it's your job to flag it, even if that's a painful conversation for the organization. We're going to need to spend some money to make this more resilient. And here's the evidence. Here's why I think we're going to have to do that. People don't always like hearing that. And we have to do it a lot. I mean, I am a business enabler in what I'm trying to do as a security function. We didn't say, no, you can't do X. It was like Iran. I said, my view is that you'll be leaving again in 18 months. But if you want to go, this is how you can go. Again, I wouldn't unpack your suitcase. I wouldn't do anything. I wouldn't take out a 30-year lease on a building, which some people did. I wouldn't do any of that. I'm not saying don't go, but you need to think about it. So again, speak truth unto power. I mean, that is the role of having an advisory intelligence function. This is the world as it is and as it's probably going to be. You can listen to me or not, but I'm trying to help you get ahead of that and be resilient. Time, cost, and quality drives everything, so optimize for an output. Again, you have to work within the resources you have, so try and do something achievable within those resources. Again, you can do this for free. A key one, really, stories sell. If you're trying to persuade people about this stuff, be an entertainer, it does help. If you can tell good stories about how other people have been affected, that sells better. And almost on to Tanya's point, why do these things stick on social media? They're good stories. Humans love stories. Management loves stories. They want data as well, of course. But if you can tell a good story about why, like I've just told you about the people in Iran, right, you'll probably remember that. And finally, always be critical, yourself and others. You will make failures of intelligence. People beat themselves up about not predicting coups. Like my analysts get really upset if there's a coup in a country they're covering, they didn't see it. Well, the government in that country didn't see it. And that's the whole point, otherwise there wouldn't be a coup. So you have to accept that sometimes things catch you out. Sometimes, like 9/11, you make a faulty judgment. You have all the information in front of you, you draw the wrong conclusion. That happens. You're dealing with predicting the future. It is hard. And we heard, I think in London, from the professional gambler who said that, prediction was basically just a wild guess. I put it to you, it's not. You can build the evidence to come up with something better than that. But ultimately, you're dealing with a range of outcomes. You're dealing with a range of possibilities. And I think it's being able to manage that and turn that into something actionable for the business that works real well. And that's what I do all the time. We have a strong meaning to the word likely, probable, improbable, unlikely. These are words that have a degree of certainty in my head about how we do it. So those are the top tips. So there we go. Bit of a whistle stop. I hope you're now all intelligence experts. You probably know as much as I do, so that's good, at least. I know that we're running very tight on time. Are there any questions at this point? Or I will definitely be around later. So yes.
You talked about people, process, and technology.
Yes.
How do you deal with executives that say process burdens me, it inhibits me, my ability to serve my clients? What's your advice there?
Process doesn't need to be burdensome.
Well, that's what they say.
Yeah. And actually a really good process. I mean, processes are about efficiency. So you should be generating something that's efficient, right? And that's the worst thing. I've seen some companies that have generated internally, and these are intelligent suppliers, incredibly burdensome processes to look at picking up data and things like this. And the actual output of the data they're collecting and the whole thing they're going through is pathetic. But it's taking 90% of the staff effort. So why would you do it? Again, optimize for outputs. A simple process that works and people remember and stick to is going to be more effective than 55 pages of forms that no one fills out. So you need to make any of these things effective. So the key one, I think, when you're trying to sell executives on things quite often, so we deal with a number of hotel companies, for example. They're operating properties around the world. They don't own most of them. Do they understand who they're doing business with? And do they understand the risks of the location they're dealing with and all that stuff? Now, traditionally, I think usually about the day before something opens, someone will come and say, can the security team come and have a look? We're about to open in the center of a nuclear testing range in Western China or something. And it's a bit late to do anything about it then, isn't it? So if you can embed things in the business early and you can kind of show people, by doing a bit of stuff now, we can save ourselves a huge amount of work down the line. Then that's a good selling point. But you all know it's not as simple as that to get in. But I think if you can sell them on why we're doing things, especially in complex global enterprises where business units are battling anyway, and we don't want to get under the EMEA director's heels because he's doing really well in Africa. And you're like, yeah, but we're racing into markets where we have no resilience. And you can see it coming. But the guy's making sales, right? He's making money because he's not investing in resilience. And sooner or later the risks catch up. So I think having something effective, but simple, and having a really good reason as to why you do it. And again, the best one is, what? Our competitors didn't have this, and look at that huge crisis they had that we all laughed at them about. Well, let's not be those guys. But it's harder across culture. It's harder in some parts of the world. But simple and effective is best. But as I said, I'm around hereafter for coffee and definitely this evening for a drink. I feel like I've earned it already, and it's only 10 a.m., so there we go. But thank you very much for your attention. As I said, I hope it's been useful, and I look forward to any feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you.